Hello, and welcome to another edition of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush. With me, as always, Dr. Philip McKenzie. That was just one syllable, I could tell. It wasn't even a word, but it was technically a syllable. Welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands, everyone. Phil, as you can tell, is glad to have you, as am I. We have another pay-per-view on deck, UFC 313, main evented by the UFC's biggest breakout star, Alex Pereira, and I do mean biggest in every sense of the word. And he is defending the strap against the eternal prospect, Magomed Ankalaev. It feels like only yesterday that Magomed Ankalaev was getting submitted in literally the last second of his UFC debut with Paul Craig, but in fact, it was 8 years ago, and he has spent the intervening time getting better?
Yes.
Well, I think he has, kind of, to be honest, but also in a much more obvious way, has not changed at all. We have been sort of obsessed and fascinated by Magomed Ankalaev for all this time, and he's finally made it to that title fight that he was sure he deserved, and frankly, given the fact that he hasn't lost since his UFC debut, probably has deserved for quite a while now. That's not to say I expect him to look particularly good under the bright lights this Saturday. Elsewhere on this card, in the co-main event, we have Justin Gaethje, who was supposed to fight, was it Chandler? No, Dan Hooker, of course.
It might have been Chandler. It was, yeah.
Yeah, I forgot. Chandler was part of the story because he said, give me a call, and then followed him up immediately with a tweet where he was like, it's not gonna happen. Unfortunately, I just can't do it. Classic Chandler double talk. So now Gaethje is instead taking on Rafael Fiziev, who has not been seen in the octagon since September of 2024, after he, sort of was losing most of the fight to Mateusz Gamrot and then blew out his knee. And of course, the fight before that was his first fight with Justin Gaethje, a very close, very exciting affair in which he lost a majority decision. There's a couple other good ones on this card. Jalen Turner, Ignacio Bahamondes, looks fun largely because it is a fight between two 6'3" lightweights. Unfortunately, they are feeding our sweet boy, King Bobby, to one of the fighting nerds, Mauricio Ruffy. And, well, that's about where it runs out of really good fights, to be honest. In fact, they've done their classic move again. They buried the fourth best fight on the card in the curtain jerker slot. Chris Gutierrez, John Castaneda is a good matchup, and for some reason is all the way at the bottom of the card. I could not explain that one to you.
My assumption would be that Gutierrez is not always guaranteed fireworks.
No, of course
not.
They
think it might just be a control fight, and they don't like small people.
Yeah. We also have Joshua Van fighting on the prelims against Ray Tsuruya. That's an interesting one as well. So, it's not all bad. Unfortunately, I'm forced to say, Phil, that as far as pay-per-view cards go, I have seen worse. But that is certainly damning with faint praise.
Yeah, it has a bunch of halfway compelling fights where there's one person that you care about in it.
Yeah.
Or they're Fiziev, Gaethje, which is undeniably, going to be incredibly exciting whenever it happens.
Yeah.
But we've also seen it before.
Yep. And it's on short notice. There's a lot of reason to think it's not going to perhaps meet the bar of their first fight.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of asterisks sprinkled throughout, but hey, it does have a genuine bona fide pay-per-view main event. And frankly, I can't lie. I am interested to see how Magomed Ankalaev does at this level. because I have a very good idea now of how he performs against the bulk of the light heavyweight roster, which is to say he sort of tries his best not to win, but can't help it because he's fighting the UFC light heavyweight roster. I'm curious to see how he handles Alex Pereira, and certainly curious to see how he implodes, which I'm sight unseen sort of expecting right here from the outset. And we may get to, at the end, a little discussion of last week's fights. We were wrong, for example, about Manel Kape Asu Almabayev being an absolute stinker. It was one of those rare fights where Manel Kape decides he has an inborn advantage from the beginning and just goes after his opponent. And in this case, went after him in particular with some of the most precise and technical fouls I've ever seen. So,
yep. You know, Zappenbeck was watching that.
Yes.
Just like,
yep,
saying, yeah, that's some good shit right there.
I would never do it that technically, Zappenbeck was saying, but
yes,
I would do it that blatantly, and I respect that.
Yes.
He was a little annoyed because Kape was doing it so quickly that people couldn't initially tell how much he was cheating. He was like, but that's not his fault. He's a fast flyweight. Okay, I can allow that, he was thinking. So if we get to any of that, it'll probably be bonus material over there on the Heavy Hands Patreon. Let's cut the crap though and talk about this main event. Alex Pereira, Magomed Ankalaev. Explain Magomed Ankalaev to me, Phil. What's the book on this man?
He's like reverse Leon Edwards. He's someone with like a fairly broad skill set who started off as being mostly like a top control wrestling guy, and has since just kind of allowed that to fall away completely.
Yeah,
with some weird exceptions, in favor of literally just leaning into his striking game. Like Leon Edwards sort of became more and more of a wrestler as time went by. Magomed Ankalaev is someone, also like John Jones, let's not forget.
Yep.
He's following in the footsteps, and we've said that before, following in the footsteps of, the greatest light heavyweight of all time, in that he's moved from like having an overwhelming advantage in the single area that all light heavyweights are bad at.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's just decided to stop using it over time.
Yeah, I would actually say I've done quite a bit of research on Ankalaev. If I sound sort of depressed and suicidal to you, then that should explain it. I would actually say I don't think he was ever all that interested in top position grappling. He was certainly more willing to go to it before. As we know, based on his fight with Jan Blachowicz, he now has to be beaten to the point where he literally has two crippled legs before he will even consider hitting a takedown. You have to make it the only option, not only to win, but to survive, for him to go to it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he has always thought of himself as a slick counter striker, as a dangerous, fast striker. And, cause even Paul Craig had to do some coaxing to get him to accept top position. And then he discovered he was kind of winning there easily and stuck to it and then lost. By the way.
Yes, all part of the plan.
Yeah. By the way, having just rewatched it, I gotta say, I don't know what was going through Magomed Ankalaev's mind at the time, but it does say something about his mentality as a fighter, his sort of inherent risk averseness, that he tapped to a choke with 1 second left in a fight that he was winning.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he didn't know there was 1 second left, but I would imagine he probably heard the horn or the clappers. So, like, wouldn't you expect many MMA fighters to just try to stick it out in that position?
I would imagine he didn't hear.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. Was in a situation of like such, I want to say like heightened awareness, but it just being absolutely flooded with.
Yeah, probably.
He just had no idea what was going on outside of the moment.
Yeah,
Not everyone is Dricus du Plessis.
It does make it's certainly a more ironic way to lose that. Like if you get sparked out with 1 second to go, there's nothing you can do about that. Tapping out, he wasn't having his joint dislocated. He was getting choked with 1 second left.
Yeah, you could just go to sleep, sure. Yeah.
I mean, you know, I'm never one to say, oh, you should go to sleep. If you know you're caught, you submit. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But, it does add to the sort of tragic comedy aspect of it that's the way he had to go out in his still only loss in the UFC.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing is that I'm surprised to hear you as down on Magomed Ankalaev as you are. I mean, maybe it's because you've had to like go back and rewatch all of his.
It is a miserable experience to watch through this guy's UFC career. It really is.
But yeah, because last time you were actually pretty pleased with how he looked against Rakic.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, Ankalaev is, I think, I have some problems we'll get into with like the structure, the process of his game, but on a sort of in broad strokes, he's a very good counterpuncher. Ankalaev is a rare light heavyweight who has striking defense and always uses it aggressively, which sounds like a strange thing to say about Ankalaev, who is notably one of the least inherently aggressive fighters in the division, but he does use his defense to fire off strikes. If you throw something committed on Ankalaev, he will fire back. And he selects his shots well. He counters to the body and the head. He's got an uppercut. He's got a wide left hand. He's got a straight left hand. He loves the counter right hook. And about 3 times per fight, he puts together a really cool combination on the counter. So these were the things. Yeah, I see him using his skills, and I'm like, wow, no other light heavyweights can even think of doing this. It's cool. But when you see all of his fights back to back to back, it is impossible to escape the impression that rather than, like a great counterpuncher would, making his opponent give him opportunities, he has a horrible penchant for allowing his opponent to work. That is how his counterpunching process goes. And I also could not escape the impression that this would not work in a better division. Because there's this recurring pattern where anytime Ankalaev fights someone who is in any way a challenging style matchup, he does not look good. He doesn't lose.
Examples?
Jan Blachowicz. Blachowicz is a great example. Fucking Johnny Walker in the first fight managed to make him look pretty shitty for a lot of it while being incredibly shitty himself. Thiago Santos dropped him.
Yes.
2022 Thiago Santos, a terrible iteration of Thiago Santos. I have to say, the most gun-shy fighter you could possibly ask to fight Ankalaev, who just cornered himself over and over and over again, refused to throw combinations, which I'll get into that, is a exactly the thing you don't want to do against a counterpuncher, but which every one of Ankalaev's opponents starts to do very quickly into the fight. They just stop throwing combinations. A Thiago Santos who would pull his own punches because he was so nervous about what was coming back at him. He sort of accidentally dropped Ankalaev at a later point in the fight. He just ran at him, in his only blitz of the entire fight, and Ankalaev's defense and footwork utterly collapsed. So this is the thing. It's like Ankalaev hasn't lost since his UFC debut, but anytime he fights somebody who has any ability to challenge him at his range, he doesn't look impressive. If Alexander Rakic had simply stood his ground like 30% more in their fight, he probably would have made Ankalaev look bad too. He simply, went into that fight thinking, I'm going to run around the entire time. And also, of course, his corner told him he was up 2 rounds going into the third, when in fact the exact opposite was true. So just horrible decision-making on the parts of his opponents are as much responsible, the way I see it, for Ankalaev's UFC record as are his own skills.
Yep.
So that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Uninspired.
Yeah. Yeah, I will say it's one of the, we've got a lot of criticism for the UFC business model for many reasons. One of the things I will say is that I do like when matchups like this happen. They do show that there is at least some meritocracy still like picking away under the surface in the UFC.
Sure.
Because were this a promotionally focused business and you were looking at, how many stars does the UFC have at the moment? You would never allow this. You would never allow this incredibly unpersonable, but actually quite dangerous.
Yeah.
Completely, fairly unknown by, mostly everyone apart from Ramzan Kadyrov, guy to fight your last remaining star at this point.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're here, and I do like that this kind of thing can happen, that we can get the RDAs versus the Pettises.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I'm happy that Ankalaev is getting his title shot. He deserves it. Mm-hmm. He absolutely deserves it. So yeah, I agree. I'm glad to see it. It doesn't mean I think he's going to show up and perform well. I have a strong belief that he's somewhat incapable of that. I'd love to be surprised, though.
Yeah, I mean, because this, to some extent, does feel like a matchup of someone who has historically over their MMA career, like, underperformed expectations against someone who has historically overperformed. Because that's what makes Alex Pereira so challenging to, pin down in this sport. Because he is obviously fighting in a bad division, in a bad state. It's the light heavyweight division is as bad as it's been for a very, very long time at the moment. And he's been given mostly plum matchups that he has carved through, with very little effort whatsoever.
For a second, I thought you were talking about Nevada. He's fighting in a bad state.
Yeah.
I agree.
But the other thing about this is that he's also someone who is visibly, tangibly improving.
Yes.
In a way which very, very few fighters do or can.
Yeah.
At his age, and also his fact that he was essentially just trained in a completely different skill set. I mean, we have, as we've said before, when people looked at who was going to be better going into MMA between him and Adesanya, there was no question about what people thought, because of the way that they fought, their natural comfort that you could see just from their early fights.
Right.
In terms of how they, approach grappling. Izzy is just a fundamentally more, handsy physical fighter, despite, not being...
He was handling scrambles.
As big and powerful.
He was handling scrambles and takedown defense pretty well from the early stages. He really was.
Yeah, and he's just a naturally, clinchier, stickier fighter.
Yeah.
Who just, you could just see this guy's going to be better at MMA than Alex Pereira is. And Alex Pereira has, another thing about Izzy is that he got to a certain point and then he just got worse.
Yeah.
Alex Pereira started from a lower base and has simply just gotten better over time.
It's unclear how much he's gotten better in his weak areas to this day. It's unclear how possible it is to simply out-wrestle him. We will get into the likelihood of that actually happening here, of course. But I think it does speak to Pereira's genius as a fighter that he has gotten better as an MMA striker. In a similar way to, Ioana Jędrzejczyk. another career kickboxer who came to the
I
sport.
mean, he's just gotten better as a striker, full stop.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
He's just a better striker now than he was as a kickboxer.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, better footwork, much better use of his kicking game and his attritive weapons, not as dependent on his one-shot knockout power. But I also like that Pereira is a fighter who I think he really understands the flow and the story that's playing out in the fight. I think that Khalil Roundtree bout is an excellent example of this. That was a fight in which Pereira was not overly focused on winning the rounds. He was instead totally invested in following the course that would ultimately break Khalil Roundtree. And that's a kind, like we can critique guys like Manel Kape for being bad at winning rounds. And obviously on a certain level, you do want to win rounds. But I really admire the principled approach of Alex Pereira, that he went into that fight seeming to think, it's okay if I give up early portions. This is all part of the process that will lead to a finish. And he just stuck to that methodical pressure, the use of the jab, drawing Roundtree's strikes out, chipping away with his low kicks. He really, really was building the knockout from the beginning, even if it meant giving away some early momentum to Roundtree. He simply wasn't worried about that, which I really admire. Let's talk about the wrestling, because this is, of course, one of the big stories. Is a bunch of people are out there already convinced themselves that Ankalaev is simply going to go out there and out-wrestle Alex Pereira. I will say right now, I do not think that will be plan A. And even if it's a plan B, I have some serious questions about how effective Ankalaev will actually be. Not because I'm impressed by Pereira's defensive wrestling in particular, but because it is so clearly not the thing Ankalaev wants to do. And that is always a bad sign if you're going to lean on something strategically that you visibly hate doing.
Yep.
And he hates doing it for a reason. Like, he's not a particularly comfortable wrestler. He doesn't have many good setups. His wrestling background, in fact, is in Greco-Roman, which is, if anything, probably worse than judo. Just like statistically speaking, as a wrestling grappling base for MMA. And it doesn't seem to have translated at all into his game. His takedowns tend to be kind of ugly and forced when he does go for them. He's got a couple nice, trips and twist downs and stuff like that, but literally the only person since his debut that he has beaten or even survived against, really, primarily using his wrestling, was Jan Blachowicz.
Yep.
One fight after Blachowicz got horribly out-wrestled by the ancient Glover Teixeira, and again, Ankalaev had to get both legs taken out from under him before he even thought about it, and the takedowns were not very well done. They simply worked because Jan Blachowicz is a terrible wrestler. He's not cleared a very high bar with what is so clearly his B game that I have a hard time envisioning him building a win here based on his wrestling. I don't care that he's fighting Alex Pereira. I think it's going to take some serious convincing himself to get there. And I think that is for a good reason, because it's clearly not something he's all that good at, honestly. He's not a very good takedown artist.
Yeah. And yeah, I tend to agree. And I also like Pereira is someone who's shown so much discipline in how he's improved himself that I'm willing to bet that he has invested into at least surface level takedown defense.
Yeah, you got to think.
You cannot simply muscle him into the cage and pull him over Prochaska, I believe, tried that at some point. And it was just no, unless you have actual takedowns, like, this isn't going to work. He might well, kind of lack subtlety and, if he fought a dedicated wrestler, if, Daniel Cormier was still in the division, or even, if he fought Glover Teixeira back when Glover Teixeira was still doing things, or maybe even Phil Davis. But it is very notable, none of these people fight anymore in the UFC.
Yeah. Also, if you are a guy who muscles your takedowns, he is, as we may have mentioned this before, gigantic.
Yes.
And very strong. So that's another reason perhaps not to pour all your strength into trying to get at his legs.
Yeah. There's obviously also the Ankalaev's issues with getting low kicked by
that's an obvious
Jan
one. Yeah.
He is actually, as we might have said, he's actually quite good at checking low kicks and defending low kicks.
He checked a lot of Blachowicz, it just didn't work.
Yeah.
Jan just willingly kicked him in the shin.
Yeah, and so I think this is one of the areas where it's going to be the same problem, but in a different way.
Yeah.
Because the problem with Blachowicz was that Blachowicz just kind of kicked through him. And the problem with Pereira is that he's extremely difficult to defend low kicks against.
He's a very subtle low kicker.
Yes, one of the many ways in which he's just a much better fighter than he was as a kickboxer.
Yeah, he also probably could afford to just kick through checks like Blachowicz did if he had the idea, because this is a unique quality that Pereira and Blachowicz share. They are both freakishly powerful kickers.
Yeah.
Like in a way that is difficult to explain. Like I can count more than one fight of Jan Blachowicz where he kicked somebody in the body one time and left a tattoo of his instep on their ribcage. That just doesn't happen with other people's kicks, but it happens more than once with Jan Blachowicz. And as we know from the testimony of Israel Adesanya and others, Pereira's kicks feel like getting whacked in the leg with a steel bat. There's just something unusually powerful about even his kicks, which are subtle because he doesn't put much into them. He doesn't rotate his upper body. He just flicks them out there. Cut kicks, I think those are sometimes called. And yet they land with devastating impact. It doesn't really make sense, but it seems like a very obvious problem area for Ankalaev because, even Johnny Walker gave him problems with the low kicks, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, not big problems, but problems nonetheless. So, I think it is difficult to really see Ankalaev winning unless you're just saying, Pereira is a very hittable man sometimes.
Yep, he is.
And Ankalaev is a good and powerful counterpuncher. Yep. But even in, this particular example, one of Ankalaev's issues in this kind of matchup is that he's just not like a massive one-punch hitter.
No. He's got fast
Certainly
hands.
Not in the same way that,
Certainly not like Pereira.
Certainly not in the same way that Pereira is.
Yeah, yes. Exactly. He's got very quick hands. I will note that, he is particularly fond, some might say too fond, unimaginatively fond of the counter right hook, which is not only, in my opinion, kind of the hardest shot to confront as an orthodox fighter coming from a southpaw. Also, I think a particular vulnerability of Alex Pereira's.
Yeah.
He is hittable by right hands, and southpaw right hands are only trickier and quicker to the target and harder to see coming. Khalil Roundtree hit him with some good right hooks, for example, another southpaw who's much smaller than Ankalaev. Shorter, anyway.
Yep.
So Ankalaev's going to have some success with that. He's going to catch Pereira over the top of his jab, or he's going to slip Pereira's right hand and land that right hook. But who does he knock out with those shots? Let's see. Late stage Johnny Walker, late stage Anthony Smith.
Wasn't durable in his prime.
Yeah.
Either.
Yeah.
Like he was KO'd by what's his face, Corey Anderson.
Yeah, famous glass cannon Johnny Walker. And then you have to go all the way back to 2020 to see him knock out Iwan Kutalaba.
Mm-hmm.
He's, it's partly because he just doesn't press the issue, but it's also because he mostly tends to land one shot at a time.
Yep.
And yeah, I want to get back to what I said about how badly his opponents have approached him. When you are fighting a counterpuncher, your instinct will be to not throw too much because he's punishing you when you throw. And so it's very understandable from that perspective why so many of Ankalaev's opponents have relegated themselves to single strikes only. But as with many things in the martial arts, your instincts are wrong. Throwing one punch at a time is precisely the best way to get countered as often as possible. Because one of the simplest ways to make a counterpuncher nervous about countering you is to throw 3 punches. Because he's going to try to counter the first one. That's the easiest one to counter, is something just out there in no man's land. One single strike, one single opening, boom, job done. Alex Pereira is not a great defensive fighter, but he likes to punch with people. And he's good enough defensively and has good enough timing and throws nice, short, tight technical punches that he will accept an opportunity to meet you on equal footing and just throw 3 punches, which he tries to throw inside the punches you're throwing back at him.
Yep.
And it was exchanges like these that allowed him to ultimately break and destroy Khalil Roundtree. He got hit by some of his counters, and then he just started throwing a right hand and a left hook inside Roundtree's more looping shots and just started catching him and hurting him.
It was also that as the fight went on, he started to use the open stance jab more and more.
Yes.
And he was initiating exchanges from, far away, but relatively safely. Again, another thing which is just he didn't used to do this that much when he was a kickboxer, and now he's has a very, very dangerous jab. And yeah, like you said, if Ankalaev's plan, if he's going to be trying to counter the jab with a right hook, it might work sometimes, but that's not a good probabilistic counter.
Right.
You will simply end up eating much more jabs than you counter, and they are very hard jabs.
Yeah.
And eventually you will lose your confidence in it. You can't win like that.
Yeah. And he's really kind of got one counter right hook too. I suppose he has a couple ways of getting into it. For example, he likes to throw the counter right. He likes to bait you by lifting the right leg and then sit down on the right hook as you try to fire. Or he uses that to get into range and make you twitch, and then he fires the right hook. But pretty much all of them, he just likes to dip down and wing the right hook. And this is the other thing with Ankalaev. He also has a bad habit of overthrowing, which his opponents are characteristically terrible at punishing. But it does happen quite a lot. He overthrows and gets himself off balance. Sometimes with the right hook, especially when he throws his left hand, he really tends to overcommit and fall in because he's relying on his speed and timing to get to the target where, with enough effect that it doesn't matter that he's out of position, much like Conor McGregor, for example. And Alex Pereira is no small shakes as a counterpuncher himself. He actually is a very dangerous counterpuncher if you overextend and fall into the pocket against him. You will receive the worst uppercut you've ever imagined. So I just think, it's this bizarre thing where Ankalaev is so clearly better than basically everybody in this division. But this just feels like one of those fights where the, frankly, very rudimentary counterpunching game that he plays is not going to have enough flexibility in it to adapt to Pereira, who is himself actually a pretty good adaptive striker.
Yeah, I agree. I think he demonstrates more adaptability inside the fights themselves. He's developed more adaptability basically over the course of his career.
Yep.
Yeah, I do just have to pick Pereira. I will say, as like a caveat, we got to make sure we don't oversell the difference between them too much. They have both essentially fought one good light heavyweight each.
Yeah.
And it was Jan Blachowicz. And they both struggled with him a lot. Neither of them did particularly well against him.
Yeah, but let me ask you a question. This isn't just an MMA math thing. I would say that Pereira also beat Prochazka, who is a broken, but in his own way, definitely a good. He's one of the elite light heavyweights. There's no denying that. How do you think Ankalaev?
Yes.
How do you think Ankalaev
I don't know.
would fare against Prochazka? He'd have a lot of counter opportunities.
I think he might cook him.
Maybe.
I think he probably would cook him.
The guy who refuses to respect the counters, though, is in some ways the worst matchup for Ankalaev. The guy who you can hit, you can even hurt, but who, as the fight goes on, will just pile on, add depth to his combinations and his attacks, and force you into the cage. And on the rare occasions when somebody has actually bossed Ankalaev into a corner, he looks bad. He looks really uncomfortable there. I just think it's this weird thing where he has successfully convinced every light heavyweight he's fought not to test him. He makes them all way too twitchy and nervous and hesitant. And that just wouldn't happen to Prochazka. So yeah, it's a matchup where he would have obvious success. I think he might fold as the fight went on, though. I have a strong feeling Prochazka might make him really, really uncomfortable. I'm uncertain about that one.
Yeah, I don't know. It's difficult to say. He's definitely he's a strange guy. But that Blachowicz fight is, simultaneously a damning indictment of his ability to read his opponent and what he should be doing and so on. But it is also a fight where he really came back really strongly and really clearly won the last 2 rounds despite being very badly hurt.
Mm-hmm. Did you?
I don't think. Yeah. Sorry. Go.
No. Please go on.
So yeah, he does have some genuine mental toughness in there.
Oh yeah, undoubtedly.
But yeah, I'm just thinking of the fact that both against someone who's, because yeah, Pereira is fighting people who are either technically atrocious or just physically fragile.
Yeah.
At this, or mentally fragile at this. Khalil Roundtree putting on a career-based performance, but it's still Khalil Roundtree.
Right.
He's just not a durable fighter.
Yeah.
And
he really stepped up.
And by both of at the end of both of their fights against Jan Blachowicz, they'd just gotten themselves both into the ugly slogs where everyone was gassed out.
Yeah.
And this could end up as an ugly slog where both guys are gassed out. And maybe at that point, Magomed Ankalaev just starts falling over on him like he did Jan Blachowicz. I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
I think just the sheer attritional power of Pereira, just the fact that he's a better, smarter fighter means that I have to pick him, and I have to pick him to win more convincingly as time goes on.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't want to oversell Pereira as a complete destroyer and Ankalaev as just a decision merchant. As a puny decision merchant, just at least partially because Pereira has been fighting absolute layups.
You are right. That is a very good point to emphasize. Yeah, that Blachowicz fight from Pereira is really not a very good showing. In part, that's because it's similar reasons that Ankalaev struggled with him, but kind of reversed, because Blachowicz's real superpower, aside from the freakishly powerful kicks, is that you can't outkick him. He's actually way too good at defending kicks.
Yeah.
And
that he's also disgustingly physically durable.
Yeah, that too.
Like he's been KO'd once.
Yeah, that too.
By Thiago Santos.
And he had to fully run into the counter to get KO'd by him.
Yes.
he had to go like, Marcin Proknio against Sam Alvey style into the counter to get knocked out.
Yeah. Yes, combining all the momentum from both sides as much as humanly possible.
So even Pereira was not able to escape Blachowicz' power to make his opponents look shitty. It's true.
Yeah. And so I think that the chance that this is like close is a possibility. But again, I can't pick Pereira. I can't pick Ankalaev, and I don't think anything in this fight's going to happen that's going to make me be like, oh, I should have picked it.
I agree.
Yeah, it's just the adaptability, the power. I think that Pereira has simply looked much better after that Blachowicz fight, even if it is against layups. He's just improved tangibly in rematches with against Yuri Prochazka.
Yeah, it's true.
He's just a very impressive fighter. He just happens to be fighting in a really bad division.
Did you happen to see, as a final point, floating around on Twitter, there was some image posted to Instagram of Ankalaev with Nina Drama? I didn't know who this person.
No,
I didn't know who this person was either. She's some sexy Instagram influencer or whatever, or YouTuber or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. She just wears like cleavage shirts and does interviews with fighters and stuff. That's as much as I've been able to gather. The clip of her with Ankalaev, she is wearing a full bodysuit, ankles covered, and a hoodie up to the throat. I'm shocked she was allowed to have her hair uncovered. It was it's like you could just see what the terms Ankalaev had for her recording a video with him. Kind of defeats the point of her interviewing style.
Yeah, that's you've ruined the gimmick here.
That got a laugh out of me though.
That's very good. What would make it even better would be if he doesn't actually care about that kind of stuff at all. He just thought he could get away with it.
Yeah, that would be
like,
funny.
I'll only do this if you wear like the stupidest looking bodysuit imaginable. And afterwards he's talking to his friends like, can you believe she fell for that?
Sadly, I have reason to suspect he probably does care about that kind of thing, but who knows? Who knows? Anyway, please, Ankalaev, let this be the fight where you surprise me. It hasn't happened in nearly a decade. It hasn't happened since you surprisingly lost, in fact, in your UFC debut.
Exactly. It hasn't happened in a good way.
Yeah, but I won't be surprised by a loss here. So surprise me and show an intelligent approach. Show that you've studied Pereira. You have a good idea of how to draw him into your counters and how to neutralize his attacks, how to pressure him perhaps. I cannot possibly count on that happening because Ankalaev is one of the least surprising fighters in the entire division. He's just the same every time.
Yep. Maybe he's just built up a stock of karma from all the like Johnny Walker and Ion Cutelaba and all of his times being the light heavyweight straight man.
Yeah. Suffering in light heavyweight limbo.
And then Pereira just, blows his knee out instantly.
That could happen. Yeah, he has certainly paid his time in purgatory, Magomed Ankalaev. So, now that he's finally here, you may be right. Something cosmic may be on his side, but, who am I to guess the minds of the old ones? If they want to surprise me, they're free to do it. I'll be here to watch it. But the pick is Alex Pereira, unsurprisingly.
And it has to be.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's call it there. Take a break. When we come back, the co-main event, Justin Gaethje versus Rafael Fiziev. After that, Jalen Turner, Ignacio Bahamondes, Bobby Green versus Mauricio Ruffy. And we might get into a little Manel Kopp, etc. talk. At the end, as I said before, that will almost certainly be bonus material, especially considering that we've already done like 40 minutes on just the main event. So we'll be back for all of that, some of that, something after this.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
Welcome back to Heavy Hands. Let us talk about some lightweights. Justin Gaethje has been booked for the co-main event slot of UFC 313 for an entire training camp. Of course, most of that training camp up until I think a week and a half ago, he was expecting to fight Dan Hooker, who broke his left hand, I think, and has now been replaced with Rafael Fiziev, who fought Gaethje for Fiziev just 2 fights ago, but that was in fact all the way back in spring of 2023. And he has had some difficulties since then. He's now stepping up on short notice. I kind of have a bad feeling about where Fiziev is at in his career right now, but let's talk about it. What do you think?
I'm struggling to think of a time when I've seen fighters that I think are as well defined in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And that have already fought, where I'm, less sure about what this fight is actually going to look like and how it's actually going to play out.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm not really sure where either of these guys are at.
That's a fair point. I should have mentioned Justin Gaethje also looked like shit in his last fight and got absolutely owned by Max Holloway.
Yeah, I mean, because the dynamic of their first fight is such an odd one. I mean, firstly, it's a very close fight.
Yep.
It's a fight which, like many of these, can simply, could go the other way with like a couple of adjustments. And in fact, depending on how you score, could just go the other way full stop. Like, you could just be like, oh yeah, Rafael Fiziev won that fight. I don't think he did when I scored it, but, it's also one that I'm not super invested in the outcome. It was extremely close.
Yes.
And
it's one of those where you see majority decision and you think, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. The other thing about it is that, it's that the adaptations that we see from both men that come with age, I don't know how much they necessarily, I don't know how much the dynamics favor each guy.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take Fiziev's poor performance, which was against Gamrot, which is where he basically fought. And, before that fight, we were like, well, Gamrot's a not crude, but a limited but accurate and athletic striker.
Yeah.
But mostly he's just going to be shooting double legs. Fiziev is frighteningly quick, but has a very good first layer takedown defense. Fiziev's going to carve him up, pretty much. And
we also expected he'd probably get outlasted to some extent by Gamrot because Fiziev has bad round 3s and Gamrot has fantastic rounds 3s, 4s, and 5s.
Yep. And what actually happened is that, Fiziev looked like he'd taken notice of that dynamic to, a very bad extent in that he was like, oh, I'm not going to gas myself up by going for it too hard.
Yep.
And then he just lost round 1 just getting outstruck.
Yep. Got out-jabbed by Mateusz Gamrot.
And so this becomes really tricky for me because then I'm like, what does that mean for fighting against Justin Gaethje in a rematch? Because Justin Gaethje's problem against Max Holloway was that he was much too passive.
Yep.
But then when we combine these two factors, we're like, in many ways, like Fiziev's issue against Gaethje was that he kept forcing the issue.
Yes.
Like, he kept, he would land, like body kicks or combinations, and he would keep trying to win exchanges. He would keep trying to land more combinations. I mean, we mentioned at the time that it's one of these crazy things where it's all the things that you want fighters to do, Fiziev should be doing less of. He's like working the body, doesn't do anything for him. He's following up the combinations. He should probably just take his wins. And yeah, he's fighting at a high pace that he can't actually sustain. So the question becomes for me, like, if we have a more passive Justin Gaethje and a more passive Fiziev, who just waits around like he did against Gamrot, maybe Fiziev just wins that fight, despite the fact that he looked measurably worse. Like, despite the fact that it's such a bigger drop-off for him as a fighter. It's such a more shocking, I think, bad performance than Gaethje's against Holloway. Admittedly, it is only 1 round as opposed to 5, and perhaps he had a plan to get back into the fight and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's a more concerning performance for him in many ways. But what if this just means that he can just, like, in a much slower paced fight where Justin Gaethje has become more and more allergic to actually leading, maybe Fiziev can simply just score and stay ahead? That's why it's so weird to me, because based on how they look, I would just, based on how the fight went, and, I think Justin Gaethje has had genuinely good performances since then.
Mm-hmm.
And, Fiziev has both had his body falling apart and looked like shit. My instinct is that to just slam the Justin Gaethje pick. I'm not sure whether that's what the dynamics of this fight are actually telling me, so I'm just very confused.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's tough. It's very tough to know what to expect out of both of these guys at this point. I think, it feels a little more like there is more to explain Gaethje's performance against Holloway. Like, first of all, it's Max Holloway. That is just an incredibly high level person to have to deal with at that range, and a guy who has himself been investing in that style that he plied in that fight for years now. He also pretty badly injured Gaethje with, frankly, not an accidental, but still a lucky shot in the first round.
Yes.
A very fortunate turn of events. Not to say that it wasn't orchestrated or well-timed or whatever, but, it's not often that somebody just ducks nose first into a spinning back kick. And, I think Gaethje was in a bad way, basically right from the beginning, when he very well, under different circumstances, might have adjusted into it. As you said, that kind of applies to Fiziev too, though, against Gamrot.
Mm-hmm.
It's not clear how this approach from him would have played out if he'd been given more time. And it's also not like he got owned by Gamrot in round 1. He had difficulty with him. He was getting touched by him to a surprising degree, but he also got a few of his own good shots in, and he looked comfortable. He didn't look like he was at a loss for what to do. So
yeah, and it may have simply been one of those fights where he decided to make the calculus that he that he would be able to adapt to striking as long as he didn't get taken down.
Yeah, and also probably
prioritizing
he might
prioritizing level changes.
Yeah, and probably one where he thought he
might
could
be losing early, but if the fight keeps going like this, eventually I'm going to smoke him.
Right. Yeah, and that he could delay the sort of intensity, in a Romero type of way. I'll dump more energy into this fight when it's in the middle rounds, and that'll keep me in good standing going into the 5th. The thing is, does Fiziev really have an innate advantage if we're assuming a two-sided, more passive fight where, as a result, more time is spent at kicking range. Fiziev is a good kicker. He's a fast kicker. Gaethje is not exactly out of ideas at kicking range either. Gaethje is good at countering kicks. He's excellent with his own kicks. Both guys can deliver some serious damage at that range. It's also hard to ignore the fact that while I don't expect it to show up until round 3 at the earliest, once Gaethje did hit upon the jab, he started to own Fiziev with it. Like really, really dominate him with the jab. And I think that's because...
Again, the Holloway fight, though.
That it did happen against Holloway, too. He then just forgot about it a second time. But even in the Holloway fight, he was like, what if I jab? It happened right around round 3, and he kind of started to take over the momentum. It's just such a consistent thing. It's maddening that he doesn't even think of that weapon until that point in every single one of these fights. But it suggests he will find it at some point. And I think this is part of why Gamrot was surprisingly difficult for Fiziev as well. Part of it was the threat of the takedown, I'm sure. But Fiziev is a high-intensity trigger counterpuncher.
Mm-hmm.
He is a guy who will slip a shot and fire back with 3 full-power, lightning-fast punches. And it makes sense that, yeah, the jab is the shot that works against this guy. The jab is the hardest punch to counter. It doesn't require big commitment. It doesn't give a big telegraph. The jab is the weapon you use to deny your opponent the chance to find those counters. And I think Fiziev is a little bit of a sucker for a good jab, if I'm honest.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, I think he also probably would have looked terrible against Max Holloway for this exact reason.
Yeah, exactly.
Or at least, he would get absolutely landslid down the stretch.
Yeah.
The other part of it is, Fiziev as a counterpuncher, but, counterpunching in combination just meant that he was constantly ending up in the clinch with Gaethje. And Gaethje was basically doing, his thing of just slipping and throwing huge bombs without necessarily looking at where they're going to go. Or just, or then grabbing a collar tie and slugging it out. And over time, that simply overpowered Fiziev.
Yeah.
Gaethje is just bigger and more, I don't say durable, but he's just, it's not quite the right word to use. He's just more of a hoss.
He's mentally durable.
Twitch guy.
Certainly.
Yeah.
He understands from the earliest days of his career that getting hit ain't a problem. You can still win.
Yep.
Just keep pressing. Yeah. I mean, is what we're describing really all that different from their first fight? Like, the reason that fight ended up being so crazy is because of who these guys are, even underneath these sort of layers of more intelligent, more reserved fighting, right? Like, Gaethje was essentially trying to counterpunch Fiziev in their first fight. He was holding back. He was waiting for Fiziev to come in. And then when Gaethje counters, that's when you remember he's still Justin Gaethje, because he throws crazy hammers and overswings and, puts together these ferocious combinations, whatever.
Yep.
That's kind of what we're talking about happening here. Like, I think.
I mean, I don't know whether that's what's going to happen, though.
Right, but that's what we're guessing might happen here. What feels kind of likely is like Gaethje has been in this more reserved style for years now.
Yes.
And it's Fiziev, the one who seems to have made the more recent change, which was maybe just for a specific opponent, maybe was a reaction to his first loss in the UFC to Gaethje. We don't know. Maybe other factors are playing in as well. But the thing is that I think on a fundamental level, whatever strategy Gaethje brings to a fight, when it's go time, he's still very much Justin Gaethje. And like, we know since the Ferguson fight, even before then, Gaethje has been doing this longer range, more counter-oriented style. How many insane wars has he had since that Ferguson fight? If you insist or simply give him the openings for his counters, the war will break out. He can't help it. So I don't know. Maybe we're overplaying the idea that this will be very different from their first fight. Maybe we just already had a really good picture of what the essential dynamic is between these two guys.
Well, I mean, that's another one of the things that I'm just not sure about. Like, if the dynamics simply end up playing the same way.
It was a super close fight.
I do. Yeah. I think I'm going to pick Fiziev. I know he, again, like I was tempted to just slam the Gaethje pick because, again, Fiziev is despite being like a very technical fighter in many ways, is obviously incredibly athletically dependent. He's extremely fast twitch.
Yep.
He is clearly someone who is riding the absolute razor's edge of his athleticism in that he cannot quite maintain the pace that he himself wants to hit. So, any fall off from that point can be catastrophic. He's had a bad injury. He's probably not the smart pick. On the other hand, like, he does strike me as like a fairly intelligent fighter. And he is a striking coach.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't always the, he applaud it that it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And Gaethje, again, didn't look good, in a very consistent way in his last fight over, the entirety of a fight. And, I don't know whether Gaethje wins, if Fiziev comes up with a plan which is simply, exchange with him less, jab myself more, kick more, low kick more. Gaethje didn't really actually defend any of the low kicks that well, but Fiziev is a pretty tremendous.
Oh, he's a powerful kicker,
defender and counterer.
Oh,
and also very good at defending and countering kicks. Very, very good at that.
Yep.
If he just makes slight changes to the matchup, he can change. He can, and I feel like he is probably the more likely to be able to make changes. But he's also more likely to be just, fall off a cliff physically.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I'm very confused on this one. I don't have a strong feeling. As I said, it's one of the more, I know who both of these guys are. I've seen them fight. Fights that I've tried to pick where I just still don't really know what the outcome is. I'm going to pick Fiziev just because I think I'm going to guess that he can make adaptations, or even just on a probabilistic thing, is that they just have super close fights.
Yeah, right.
And maybe he just wins one of them because that's how it goes. Just like a Bayesian thing.
Yeah, oh, totally. I mean, yeah, that seems like the only way you could make a really smart pick here is to be flip a coin, because their last one was razor close, and honestly, Fiziev might have won it. And, yeah. I mean, I think your point about crashing into the clinch, I would even broaden that a bit and say that when Fiziev does go, I think he is an inherently committal striker. And
100%.
That was part of the problem he ran into with Gaethje too. Because, as I said, Gaethje doesn't mind if you commit, even if you land on him.
That's what he wants.
Exactly, yeah. If you crash into his space.
It's not just mind, it's all he wants.
Yeah. If you crash into his space, he is going to be very happy to meet you. And that was, I think, the real, strategic difficulty that Fiziev had in that fight, is that the longer it goes on, he cannot help but collide with Justin Gaethje and either get caught planting his feet to punch or crash into him chest to chest and end up in, one of these brutally uncomfortable clinch exchanges where Gaethje is just innately comfortable. I'll stick with Gaethje, but I'm more curious than I am certain of anything in this fight.
I have no strong no strong pick on this whatsoever.
How fucking crazy is it going to be when Justin Gaethje comes in here knowing well, we assume he knows. He probably doesn't remember, but having a coach who knows exactly what worked in the last fight and yet does not remember to jab until round 3.
You know he's not going to.
Of course not. It's insanely consistent.
Stipe couldn't. Justin Gaethje isn't going to.
He is insanely consistent with that weakness. I do not understand it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's...
You don't understand it, but you know it's coming.
It's reliable. It is a reliable thing to expect. Yeah, I'll stick with Gaethje. He won the first fight. I think Fiziev is closer to what appears to be an attempt to shift his style in a different direction. He had an injury that has kept him on the shelf for a year, and he has not had a full training camp. I have much more reason to simply worry about where he might be at, but there's plenty of reason to worry about where Gaethje's at too. So, yeah. I'll pick Gaethje just because. I gotta pick somebody.
Oh, yeah, you gotta pick one of them.
That's pretty much it. All right, let's take another break. When we come back, we will clean up the scraps from this card and maybe get into a little Manel Cop talk as well after this.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back. Let's talk about these absolutely gigantic lightweights. Jalen Turner versus Ignacio Bahamondes. It's hard not to notice that this is a Joe Silva style matchup in that they have simply said, we have two lightweights who are 6'3". Let's make them fight each other.
Yep.
I'm fine with that. I will say from the outset that Jalen Turner is a more frustrating fighter between the two, but that is because I think Jalen Turner is capable of more than Ignacio Bahamondes.
Yep.
Jalen Turner looks to have the athletic ability. He has the really interesting range transition aspect to his game, which sets him apart from his peers and really, really works with his frame. His ability to go from long punching range directly into like middle distance clinches into close range fighting. And he is a nuclear puncher as well. He has many of the makings of a genuine contender, and it simply appears to be a fighter who's still very much in the developing stage of his career. That's what's held him back. He makes some strange decisions. He is, it's really frustrating to watch him deal with a wrestler and see just how easily he can get taken down, but also to see, how he handles wrestlers surprisingly well despite not being able to stop them from out wrestling him. He's right on the cusp, I think, of being a really good fighter. Bahamondes is, in my mind, much more a guy I expect to remain forever in mid-card action fighter territory. He's, the funny thing is these are two 6'3" fighters who aren't particularly keen to keep their opponents at long range. That's an interesting wrinkle here. I think Bahamondes might be moving in that direction, however. We have seen, like the fight that defines Bahamondes in my mind is, I think it was his UFC debut against John McDessie. Yes, it was.
Yes.
And, it's hilarious to put a 6'3" fighter against John McDessie, who, frankly, if he'd come into the MMA 5 years later, would be a bantamweight. And then to see Bahamondes get summarily out-jabbed and countered and picked apart from long range by this tiny, tiny man who just happens to be a fantastic technician. That's the fight that defines Bahamondes, not only because he allowed a much smaller man to wreck him at a range where you would assume physically he has the edge, but also because he walked through hell over and over and over again, and just kept pressing the action in that fight. However, Bahamondes has shown a little bit more of a penchant for pressuring with the mind to counter his opponents. Trying to draw his opponents out, using his guard to catch shots until they overcommit, and then slinging in hard counter shots. It's an interesting change from the guy who was just a one-size-fits-all swarmer when he got to the UFC. It hasn't really been tested by particularly good opponents, this approach. Christos Giagos, Manuel Torres. These are the two guys. Granted, he's knocked them both out. But these aren't exactly a particularly difficult problem to solve. These are guys who are very, very willing to overcommit on stupid, backhand strikes from super long range. So if you've just figured out what a counterpunch is, that's a great place to test it out. I got to imagine if that is the approach that Bahamondes tries here, it's going to be a lot less workable against Jalen Turner, who admittedly you could say that a lot of what Turner does is overcommitting, but it's overcommitting with a purpose. As I said, Turner loves to connect from one range to the next, using his strikes to transition into grips and then to continue striking from that range. And I think a much more flexible fighter directionally as well. Turner's pretty comfortable off the back foot. He's very comfortable pressuring. And I think it's because of that willingness to fight at every range on the feet. He knows he has options. Anytime you overextend, he can crowd you. Anytime you shy away, he can get to you. That ability to bridge distances is, as I see it, really the core of his game. And the fact that I think he's a much harder puncher than Bahamondes. Not that Bahamondes doesn't hit hard enough to knock people out. Obviously he does. But Turner is a singularly dangerous puncher against a higher level of competition. So my instinct is to pick Jalen Turner.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the thing. I also want to snap pick Turner because he's a nicer looking fighter. He has what is clearly a higher ceiling. He's just fought better people. He's got a worse recent record than Bahamondes, essentially because he's just fighting really good fighters. Yeah. And Bahamondes has been fighting middle of the pack, sort of. Maybe that's even a generous thing to say about them.
Yeah.
Opponents. As you said, Turner is much more potent. He's much more accurate. If you give him space, he will just carve you up. It was relatively easy to pick the Bobby Green fight, I think.
Yeah.
Because it was just it's Bobby Green's going to do his thing where he hangs out on the edge of his effective range against Jalen Turner and, tries to trick him into doing something silly. And you don't understand that the edge of your effective range is Jalen Turner's effective range.
That's the kill zone.
Very accurate and dangerous there, yes. But on the other hand, Jalen Turner does consistently underperform. And the thing that he, relatively consistently underperform, one of the things that he just underperforms against is just raw aggression and toughness. And one of the things that has never happened to Bahamondes is he's never been knocked out. I'm not sure if I've seen him, badly hurt.
No.
That Makdessi fight is just Makdessi just jabbing him up and landing right hands over and over and over again.
Yeah, and despite the size, Makdessi is actually a pretty dangerous puncher. Like, Makdessi's super accurate, very fast hands, and, like, physically, I think a much better puncher than you would expect looking at his frame. So, and he hit Bahamondes like 150 times in that fight.
Yeah, and so, like, a huge amount of Turner's losses have been him hitting someone, and they take it, and they just keep coming after him, and they don't stop, and he kind of falls a bit.
Yeah, the Dan Hooker fight's a great example of that.
Yeah, Dan Hooker, Moicano, but also Matt Frivola.
Mm.
And most of the fights since then are people who are either going to consent to a mid-range striking match with him, in which he is simply, or, opponents who are so physically and dynamically outgunned that he's just going to obliterate them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, whilst he's like a much better fighter than Ignacio Bahamondes, and again, he has a much higher ceiling, I'm just going to pick Bahamondes on a flyer.
Okay.
He's big. He's really tough. He's just going to keep trying. Like, that's the main thing about his fights recently, is he just keeps going after people. I think this has been booked as a setup match for Jalen Turner. But, just as a flyer, I think I'm going to pick Bahamondes just because, what if all you need to be is just able to take the shots and just consistently aggressive?
Yeah, I have a hard time envisioning that, I gotta be honest. I think it's hard to overstate the role that level of opposition has played here. At least that's my strong suspicion. Let me read you the names of the guys Bahamondes has beaten in the UFC. We already mentioned Manuel Torres and Christos Giagos. Then we have Trey Ogden, the most please try to beat me fighter ever. The most risk-averse, neutralizing, will not try to win if it seems dangerous fighter ever. Rong Zhu, who has had a turnaround recently, wasn't that good the time Bahamondes fought him. And Roosevelt Roberts, a guy with an interesting game that piqued my interest just in time for him to get blown out of the UFC and lose basically every fight in the organization. Meanwhile, he's lost.
He didn't look good against Roberts either.
No. Meanwhile, he lost to John Makdessi. Very courageous performance against a much, much smaller man who really outclassed him technically. And then Ludovic Klein, who was a total mess, but a super dynamic puncher who, unlike somebody like Christos Giagos, doesn't have a habit of completely imploding after 4 minutes has elapsed.
Yep.
These are some pretty low-level opponents to win. To win against. And meanwhile, Jalen Turner, he's had a rough run. 2 of those losses were split decisions to the likes of Dan Hooker and Mateusz Gamrot. And I think you could make a strong case that the Gamrot fight, he did not deserve to lose it. Because
for sure.
The only damage in that fight, which happened at multiple points, enough to arguably pick up 2 rounds, was delivered by Turner. And then the Dan Hooker fight, like, yes, it showed that he can get driven back, and run into trouble. He also didn't actually fully collapse in that fight, however. He held his ground pretty well and found some nice counters and badly hurt Dan Hooker on at least 2 occasions by my recollection. One of them with a head kick. I remember that one. So he has been facing a much higher level of competition, and while he has not been passing those tests, he hasn't been getting any Fs either. These have all been like just shy of a passing grade. C-.
The Moicano fight is a C-.
No, the Moicano fight he got crushed. Yes, correct. That's a fighter who not only brought the naked aggression that he can struggle with, but really, really, really insisted on getting him to the ground and keeping those positions when he got them. And that is poison. That's poison for Jalen Turner. But Bahamondes isn't going to do that.
No, but I do find myself worrying whether just like maybe. And this is why I picked Turner to beat Moicano. I was like, Moicano doesn't have the durability to beat Jalen Turner.
Yeah.
But as it turned out, like, the amount of time that they spent testing that was so low that it didn't matter. But yeah, it's just, for me, it's just like a durability aggression pick. Like I said, Jalen Turner's a much better fighter than him.
Being able to soak up damage and keep going is definitely a good thing to have in your back pocket against Jalen Turner.
Yeah, and I don't know that I've ever seen Jalen Turner, like, soak up damage and win. Like, I don't think I've ever seen him, like, come back in a fight.
Yep.
I've seen Ignacio Bahamondes do it. Against people who suck, admittedly. Doesn't look good, and he does rely on, like, terrible spinning kicks. A lot of the time.
Yeah.
But yeah. Even in that Moicano fight, like, Turner potentially could have finished Moicano by decking him, and then he thought it was a walk-off KO.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, obviously Jalen Turner this has been put together for him to win this fight. But yeah, I just can't trust him, really.
Yeah, I feel you.
Against someone that I just haven't seen get KO'd or even, like, badly hurt.
Yeah, I feel you.
What if someone just goes after him and he's just like, oh yeah, I don't actually like fighting against aggression. I haven't actually changed since Matt Frivola.
Yeah, he certainly soaked up some heavy punches from the 3 minutes of Christos Giagos he had to encounter. That is, to my mind, both a good and very bad sign that you're getting shellacked by Christos Giagos. But hey, at least you absorbed the punches well.
Yep.
I can't not pick Jalen Turner here. I think he's a better athlete. I think he's a harder puncher. I think he has just a lot more flexibility in his game, and particularly if Bahamondes is going to continue leaning into what seems to be his less nakedly aggressive approach, Jalen Turner is very happy to pressure, and not having to reach really far and overextend to get to Bahamondes in the first place probably means that his one counterpunching idea is not going to be as effective. I have to pick Turner.
Yep, that's more than fair. As I said, he's obviously the obvious pick to make.
Yeah. Oh, well, thanks.
Yeah, I'm just asshole. Giving you a compliment that you managed to spot that.
All right, well, let's talk about the aforementioned King Bobby. King Green. He's taking on Mauricio Ruffy, who at this point, somewhat surprisingly, is arguably the least notable of the Fighting Nerds. A team which, much to Zane Simon's chagrin, in fact, chagrin is not nearly a strong enough word to describe what Zane Simon has been going through, a team which has been dominating the sub-ranked UFC roster, and a couple of whom have really broken through as top contenders very quickly. Ruffy is, I think is it Ruffy? Someone, the Brazilian listener, explain the rules. Explain the rules of Brazilian Portuguese. As I understand, the R can make any one of 5 different hissy, breathy, back of the throat sounds sometimes. Obviously not in the middle of a word. We know it's Mauricio, but is it Ruffy? Is it Huffy? Or is it Ruffy? Tell me. I'm gonna keep calling him Huffy because it's funnier sounding. Yeah, Ruffy has yet to really take on the upper echelon. He has been absolutely decimating the people he's been fighting. I have to say, I think I'm the least sold on his process as a fighter of all of this crop. Like, Jean Silva is bantamweight, or featherweight? Right? Bantamweight.
Oh, yeah. Featherweight.
He's featherweight Yoel Romero. He is...
Oh, wait. Wait a minute, Jean Silva is...
Long John.
Yeah.
Whatever. He's a little Yoel Romero is what I mean to say.
Yeah.
Forgive us for being stupid. He is so naturally good at fighting that you can just tell, watching 2 fights, you're like, oh, the process almost doesn't matter. That's how much better he is and how much sharper and more accurate and more coordinated he is than your average elite athlete. Carlos Praches is fighting in a worse division, and his style makes sense to me because he tends to put a lot of pressure on opponents. He really focuses on taking their weapons away from them with counters and with almost actually a Turner-esque penchant for like long-range hand fighting and grip fighting to augment his boxing. And Kyle Bahalio, I would have said, was the least inspiring, but he really, really turned a corner in that fight with Jared Cannonier and showed a much more advanced boxing game than I think he ever had previously. Ruffy, by comparison, is like a Macho Machida clone. Like, really, really patient to a fault, hangs out at long range doing bouncy footwork, and super overcommits to swing on devastating counters. He's got the speed and the timing and the accuracy, and, you know, he has a little element of a boxing game as well to augment that sort of karate style approach. But, you know, as much as we've often said that there is an eternal place for neutralizing karate stylists in MMA, I'm still unsure of how far he can take this game without showing some kind of market change, because I don't think I think it's a pretty simple dilemma that he gives his opponents. And I really wonder how well it holds up under sustained pressure, how well it holds up when somebody is actually able to like impose the pocket on him consistently. I mean, fuck, he had some difficulty with James Yontop, who was able to make that range, and Yontop is a really ugly technician. Like, the approach made sense, but technically he is no better than a crude brawler. And he still managed to get Ruffy to commit to some defensive move and then overwhelm him with hideous swinging hammer punches. So, I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those fights where I would just be thinking, Ruffy has never had someone just stick in the pocket against him, you know, as we've seen with John Strickland and so on, but is also Bobby Green's like secret sauce is that he can stand at a point in front of an opponent where they're deeply uncomfortable and he isn't. Just causes mental damage, but he's also, you know, genuinely like very defensively sound, and just has like a deep wealth of tricks and experience. This is definitely one of those times where I'd be like, yeah, this guy isn't ready for Bobby Green. If I hadn't seen Bobby Green lose to Paddy Pimblett.
Correct. And not the only uninspiring
in which case, I'm just like, this man is very athletic.
Yeah.
He's very athletic. And Bobby Green managed to get freaked out by someone with one of the worst range games I've ever seen.
Yep.
And dived into a takedown on him. I mean, like, sure, if Ruffy just gets... If Bobby just comes out and does his thing and is aggressive and just works his hands and stays in range, wouldn't be surprised to see Ruffy freaking out at all. But I can't trust him to do that because Bobby, I have to say this again, lost to Paddy Pimblett.
You don't have to say it. In fact, never say it again. I beg you. Don't ever bring that up in my presence ever again. Yeah, it's impossible not to note that Bobby Green is finally declining and has been, I think, well before that Paddy Pimblett fight.
Oh yeah, 100%, yes.
Green
this is one of those like dreadful milestones, which is when a fighter loses to someone that they have absolutely no business.
Yeah, the infamous worst loss yet.
Yeah, like because you looked at that on paper and you're just like, how is Paddy Pimblett going to win this? Is he gonna? I mean, either he has to land like a crazy, like haymaker, or I mean, that's pretty much it. Because you'd be like, Bobby Green is an incredible defensive wrestler and scrambler, and as it turned out, all the Paddy Pimblett had to do was just swing wild haymakers, and for some reason, Bobby just freaked out and then shot on him.
Yes.
Terrible.
Incredibly
just bad
bad decision.
In every single way.
Yeah. It's weird to see a guy like Bobby Green demonstrate such terrible instincts. It really is.
Yeah.
It's an inexplicable decision, which directly led to the loss. Now, it's not the first time somebody who does have, whatever you can say about Paddy Pimblett, the man is a good jiu-jitsu player.
Mm-hmm.
Great back taker, excellent top control. Like, he is a good submission grappler. And it is not the first time that Bobby Green has lost to that kind of guy. Of course, the other one was Islam Makhachev, which would seem to be a much sterner version of that same test. But there's still
Yes, you are correct, Connor. Islam Makhachev is a much sterner version of Paddy Pimblett. You are 100% correct.
You give me an obvious pick, I'll knock it down every damn day of the week. I'm as smart as Mark Shapiro, who said that the UFC could save money by running more cheap shows. I'm the business genius now. But there's still room to think, like, yeah, it's a much shittier version. It's really hard not to say that is a clear sign of some kind of decline from Bobby Green. It's not, stylistically unprecedented. Mauricio Ruffy, if you want to explain what Green did there as a very MMA like over wariness of the threat of the takedown and all the bad decisions that can flow from that ain't a problem against Mauricio Ruffy. It just isn't. Like, he doesn't wrestle people. He wants to stay at long range and do karate shit. And most of it is hands, if I'm honest. He wants to draw you in and bomb you with a big right hand. And while I doubt Green is going to put the kind of pressure on him that I think will expose Ruffy's worst weaknesses, I also kind of wonder, like, he's going to hit Bobby Green early, certainly. The speed is going to surprise him. It's going to take some adjusting. How long until Bobby Green gets the necessary reads on Ruffy's game, though? Like, he's out of range. He's not setting many things up. He's not throwing combinations. Wouldn't you expect Bobby Green to be able to kind of figure that fight out as long as it's allowed to go a few rounds?
Sure, but he lost to Paddy Pimblett.
I know. I'm still going to pick.
I'm
still going to pick King Bobby here. I just can't. I just don't think Ruffy seems like the right kind of stylistic test.
What stylistic test could Paddy Pimblett possibly offer?
Well, he's a grappler.
He is a grappler, but like Bobby Green is a genuinely good defensive wrestler and scrambler. Like, and Pimblett is a horrific offensive wrestler.
Oh, I know.
Like,
he didn't have to offensively wrestle. I know.
Yeah, there was no reason to assume this is the thing, is that Bobby Green is another one of those guys who is insanely consistent in terms of, how he approaches fights. And then he just changed his game plan against against the worst person he's ever lost to in the dumbest way imaginable.
Here's the thing though, Phil. MMA fighters are kind of dumb. Does Bobby Green know that Paddy Pimblett isn't actually as good as Islam Makhachev? I think there's a reason to think that maybe he doesn't. That he had that fight with Islam, a fight in which he also tried some offensive wrestling, by the way, made some bad decisions when he was really forced to wrestle. against a guy that he knew that this wasn't going to just be a round-winning tactic. This guy was going to try to finish him if he got him to the ground. And he made some bad decisions. And then the next time he gets a remotely similar test, he has exactly the same kind of shitty performance. That's all I'm saying. There's some stylistic consistency.
Did Pimblet
between
even
those two.
try and take him down?
He didn't have to. What I'm suggesting is that Bobby Green went into that fight thinking, oh God, this again, and made exactly the same horrible mistakes.
I cannot. I mean, the problem is that there's two sort of hypotheticals here, and one of them is, like, Bobby Green, like, he didn't have much information about Paddy Pimblett. He just knew he was a wrestler, and he just knew he was a good grappler and freaked out. But this implies that he knows who Paddy Pimblett is, and that, you know, if he'd paid attention to Paddy Pimblett, he never would have freaked out, because he would have been like, this guy's terrible.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that MMA fighters think that way. I think they're like, oh, this guy's had success, he's a star, and he's a dangerous grappler. I have to respect him exactly as if he were Islam Makhachev. That seems likely to me. It's stupid, but it seems like a likely overcorrection, very much in the nature of MMA fighters. I mean, the other counterpoint, which you should have raised by now, is that Ruffy is not all that different, at least in his one range, from Jalen Turner, who did knock Bobby Green the fuck out. So, like, that's also possible.
Yeah, I mean, Jalen Turner is a more consistent offensive threat, and, like, I think he's a relatively easy pick to beat Bobby Green.
Yeah, but Ruffy doesn't know that. Ruffy thinks he's a god.
Yeah.
He's gonna go out there and posture and look for his one opening, and, you know, it's late in Bobby Green's career. Even that kind of guy might just, like I said, he's going to touch him early. It might win the fight for him.
Yeah. It's the thing that Turner smokes people from his effective range. But Ruffy tries to draw people into his effective range doing his Machida thing.
That's true.
And yeah, there's a significant chance that Bobby just comes into that range and simply doesn't give him anything to work with.
Yeah.
Again, if this was a trustworthy version of Bobby Green, I would pick him all day. I'm not going to, because I'm sorry, Connor. He lost to Paddy Pimblett.
Shut up. Quiet, you. I know.
I have to do it.
I know. Well, I just don't want to pick Ruffy to beat Bobby Green, so I'm not going to. I'm just gonna pick the guy I like. I think there is some reason, but obviously I've talked myself into it because it's so clear that Green is not the man he once was. He held on for an incredibly long time, being really consistently good, but he has now started to lose in ways that he did not used to lose earlier in his career. Multiple different ways.
Yep. Yeah, and as it's bad when a fighter calcifies into a version of themselves, you know, and they just their weaknesses become more apparent, and, you know, anything new that they learned over the years just sort of disappears.
Mm-hmm.
It's worse when they just start panicking.
Yeah. Yep. Panicking is just another side of the usual tendency of old fighters to become gun shy. You know, it's a flip side of that, I suppose. You one way or the other, you kind of lose your ability to tell what a good opportunity is versus a bad one. What a real threat is versus a fake one. All right. Well, that is going to have to do it, I think, given time constraints for this week's episode of Heavy Hands. Of course, we will be back next week to talk about the perhaps baffling results of UFC 313. One way or the other, we have covered a lot of fights that don't seem to have particularly easy answers. And some of the ones that do seem to have easy answers are answers that we don't want to acknowledge or admit. But I'll be very, very curious to see what shakes out in that main event and just how much better than the light heavyweight norm Alex Pereira really is. I suspect the answer is considerably, but we'll see.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, find us on social media if you want to see me spurring Phil to respond to every mention I see of terrible anime and manga properties. Because if you didn't notice, you should go to the Heavy Hands Patreon and check out our first off-topic bonus episode, the centerpiece of which was Phil explaining to me the premise of a beloved manga called Grappler Baki, which is a comic about muscular men pissing on each other's faces. That was a good time.
Yep, all the time.
You can hear my response to that as a non-anime/manga fan of any kind on the Heavy Hands Patreon. We'll be back with some more interesting bonus episodes along similar lines. In fact, we both just challenged each other. I'm going to make Phil watch Star Trek DS9, and he's going to make me watch Babylon 5. Both of us have not really watched either of those. And we're both very fond of the ones that we have seen. So, sometime in the coming months, we may be catching each other up on our reactions to those two concurrently running and, let's be honest, in terms of premise, very similar sci-fi properties. So, stuff like that, as well as the usual fight breakdowns and extras on the Heavy Hands Patreon. On social media, by the way, at Evil Greg Jackson, that's Phil, at Boxing Bush, that's me. You can find me on Blue Sky at King Typo, if you're lucky. And we'll be back next week. Until then, if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.